In this video, we're diving into something truly new – practical GTO insights for multi-way pots. Until recently, these spots were incredibly tedious and nearly impossible to analyze accurately. But with new tools, I'm excited to break down my hand played on NL40K together with various nut locks and show you how these insights can help you navigate multi-way pots with confidence no matter what stakes you play. Multi-way pots are notoriously tricky. Unlike heads-up play, you're navigating more players, multiple ranges, and a ton of variability. In the past, we had to rely on basic principles or intuition to handle these spots. But now, with recent advancements in poker software, we can finally uncover what a GTO strategy for multi-way pots really looks like. I will use Rocket Solver to help you understand the nuances and ultimately improve your play in these complex scenarios. First, let's take a look at the raw hand that was played in a 4-way pot. Stefan opens on the cutoff 2.2x and the recreational player calls on the button. With around 60% VPIP, he played quite aggressively pre-flop and post-flop, especially against the perceived weakness, yet he was not a calling station and made some nice folds. I would define his profile as a mix of a clownfish and a moray eel, and if this description makes no sense to you, I encourage you to check out my video on fish profiles here. On the small blind we have one of the best racks who calls third, and I joined the party with Jack 4 suited. On a flop, both blinds check, Stefan c-bets 1/4, the rack raises about 3.x, and the small blind goes for a check raise 3-bet 2x. Someone call GTO police, this hand is getting out of control. I call, Stefan folds, and rack calls as well. The turn comes a second flush draw, and the small blind checks. What is going on here, and what do we do? Well, what we do is take a look at the solver. Firstly, we will analyze this hand the exact way it went. Then we will experiment with different preflop ranges and even some postflop multi-way nudlocks to get a better sense of how multi-way GTO works. But before that, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and drop your comment below to support the channel, thanks. Okay. First we must define the preflop ranges correctly. The cutoff wants to play a wide range, but he's out of position to a loose and aggressive fish, with two aggressively squeezing racks on the blinds. So a reasonable opening range should be around 30%. The VIP guy calls around 42% and then 3-bets some on top of that. If he calls, the small blind should squeeze wide and call much wider compared to rags only formation. It is a tricky part for the small blind to loosen up here without playing too loose. Remember, it all comes down to the equity of your hand plus your ability to realize it. If the small blind calls third, he will play a capped weak range with no position, potentially against two aggressive regulars and an aggressive fish. Here is how to build a decent calling range. Open GTO Wizard preflop and go to the highest stake possible. If you want to call wider on the small blind than GTO suggests, but without going too crazy, we can select a lower opening size for the cutoff and then add more marginal hands into the small blind's calling range. Hands that lose less than minus 15 BB per 100. Hands like suited kings, suited gapped connectors, Jack 8 suited, offsuited Broadway from Jack 10 off to Ace 10 off. With all these hands we can expect to be breaking even thanks to the higher equity realization because of the recreational player on the button. Once we have figured out the accurate preflop ranges, we can get the postflop solution and see what is GTO like for each player on the flop. Let's navigate to the postflop solution for our hand and break down the strategies for each player. The small blind has around 5% of the strongest hands, with around 17% of the medium hands and the worst position. Simplified strategy would be to just range check. The big blind has the weakest range of them all, with just 3% of the strong hands and ton of medium hands. Range check. The cutoff is the boss here. He has 5% of the strongest hands that include the unique nuts like pocket jacks and pocket queens. Also 3% of the overpairs and the best top pairs, plus a position on 2 out of 3 players. This allows him to play aggressively betting with around 60% frequency. And the button Well, we don't care about GTO here because it's not what the rec is going to do. Let's instead lock a realistic betting range. To do just that, click on Lock Strategy, use the slider to select the percentage of hands that you want to edit. For example, you could use 75% betting frequency with top pairs, and then you can press Ctrl to lock the remaining ones. Now you can go through each category and play around with the frequencies, and once you've done, make sure to hold Ctrl again and then press Lock All in order to lock the whole matrix, so the solver provides you with an exploitative solution instead of a GTO. I'll save you time and provide the final solution in a sec. Here is a realistic strategy for a relatively aggressive fish, but nothing crazy. He bets around 43%, and let's see how the strategies of other players are going to change. The blinds are going to check, and the cutoff is now betting 42% instead of 60, trying to check raise with some of his traps and then to check call with some of his medium hands instead of betting against the button, who now bets way too often and over bluffs. Given the action, cutoff bets and button raises, and small blind mean check raise 3 bets, and now we are in a tough spot. Our hand is a mixed, sometimes it's folded, called and shoved, but this is the world of GTO. Well, in practice, I'm obviously not even considering a fold here, because fish is not going to play perfectly on the latter streets, and I'll realize the equity of my hand pretty well. Also, I don't consider a shove here. My plan is to invite the fish to continue, plus I'm ready to fold if Stefan reshoves, because in such case, my hand is likely to be dominated. Once the small blind checks on the double flush draw, we must bet for protection against the draws plus get some value from the rack. We bet 2/3, the rack folds, and the small blind check calls. River comes another blank. Now the small blind almost never has a stronger hand, yet we can get called by a bluff catcher like a top pair that merged on a flop or a medium pair plus a flush draw. Anyway, I shoved and he folded. Okay, that was the fun stuff. Now let's get serious and do some real work. Firstly, let's see what changes if the fish on the button is a maniac. After increasing his betting frequency on the flop to 60%, here is what we get. The small blind stops check raising and calls a lot, getting the additional EV against the button's overbluffs. Now, when the action comes to the cutoff, if everyone checked before him, instead of betting 70% like he did before, or 43% against the more aggressive fish, now he wants to range check in order to create a wide value check raising range and then to check call with all of his marginal hands. He checks, fish bets, let's say everybody falls, cutoff check raises all of his strong hands, and then he starts floating a very wide range, pretty much any pair, pocket deuces and better, and then never folding any type of draws. Even ace highs, ace 9, ace 8 with ace of a suit are now able to check call or even to bluff check raise. Secondly, let's analyze the same hand but in a more common scenario with regulars only formation, where everybody has a GTO preflop range, buttons calling range is around 5%, small blind and big blind call much narrower. Let's examine the strategies. Small blind is going to range check, big blind is going to range check, and cutoff bets 50%, which is quite high, given that he's still out of position against the button, plus, in this case, the range of every opponent is stronger. It happens because he has the unique nuts like pocket queens and pocket jacks. If everybody checks to the button, he's going to bet 37% even though he has 0 sets and his strongest hand is 2 pairs. Thirdly, to understand the role of the unique nuts better, let's run the same simulation but remove the unique nuts like pocket queens and pocket jacks from the cutoff's range. Interestingly, his c-betting frequency drops only 5%. Even without the first nuts, his range advantage plus the second best position allow him to bet very widely. Speaking of the position, when everybody checks to the button, even though his range is quite weak with only 2.6% of the strongest hands, his best relative position allows him to bet with 45% frequency. And finally, let's see what happens if the button had both the best position and the strongest hands. Same spot, another board, queen 7-6 with a flush draw. Now the cutoff is forced to range check because he's out of position to an uncapped button whose betting range increases to a whopping 70%. Having both sets in his range and the strongest top pairs allows him to play a very aggressive strategy. Unlike in heads-up pots, better pot odds in multiways don't mean wider calling ranges. The more players in the pot, the tighter we need to call, even though our pot odds become much more favorable. This is because with each additional player, our equity realization drops significantly. This principle applies pre-flop and post-flop. Take a look. When the cutoff mean raises and everybody folds, the big blind calls around 59%. If button calls and the small blind folds, the big blind is going to defend 49%, so his call frequency decreased by 10%. Now, if small blind calls as well, the big blind is going to call only 37%. Now, he cannot profitably defend with his 8x offsuited combos, his offsuited aces, and some suited combos, because these hands are going to be dominated and they are not going to be able to realize their equity. And here is how the increased number of players affects our continuation range post-flop. Cutoff bets, button calls, small blind calls. On the big blind, we are forced to fold our weaker flush draws, hands like top pairs. The reason why we cannot continue with these draws even though we have enough pot odds is because our equity realization is going to be extremely low. If we miss our draw, it's really hard to bluff off all three opponents, and when we hit it, we are getting dominated by the better draws or not getting paid off by the weaker hands. Summary: in multi-way pots, we need to account for several factors simultaneously. First, the equity of our range versus multiple opponents' ranges. Second, equity realization dynamics. Some weaker hands like dominated draws become non-obvious folds as the number of players increases. Third, position. Having the best position when everyone checks allows us to play aggressively even if we are capped and don't hold the first nuts. Because the spots are so nuanced, the best way to master them is by studying calling and raising thresholds across various boards and formations. Observe how patterns change and put what you've learned into practice at the tables. I hope this video has given you valuable insights and the motivation to dive deeper into this wonderful game. Until next time, bye!